News of the times. The Churchill Cottage murder. Fire, blood, and a fatal will. True crime from 1879. On a cold March morning in 1879, the villages of Knowle St Giles smelled smoke drifting from the small cottage on the hill. Inside, 83-year-old Samuel Churchill lay burned almost beyond recognition. His wife insisted he had simply fallen into the fire. But the marks on his hands, the blood on her dress, and the neighbour who heard him cry "murder," and the will that he planned to change that very morning told a very different story. Victorian police believed that they were looking at a tragic household accident. A forensic surgeon believed the burns made that impossible. And the entire county would soon be asking the same question. Was Samuel Churchill truly burned by misfortune, or murdered by the woman who stood to lose everything? This is the 1879 case that shocked Somerset. Burned or murdered, the death of Samuel Churchill. And in our end of episode further particular segment, a small example of Victorian justice at its most eccentric. 3 offenders, 3 crimes, and 3 judges, and a set of sentences that make absolutely no sense when placed side by side. Even the Illustrated Police News struggled not to laugh. So sit back for a moment and allow yourself to be transported to a world of corsets, stiff collars, formidable moustaches, and a justice system as smoky and unpredictable as the coal fires that warmed Victorian parlours. Knowle St Giles, a scatter of cottages tucked into the fields of the Somerset countryside, lay just outside Charred, a quiet parish where little changed from one season to the next. In 1879 it was a place of narrow lanes and tilting hedgerows, where smoke curled lazily from stone chimneys, and the rhythm of daily life was measured by church bells, market days, and the slow turning of the fields. The railway line between Charred and Ilminster ran only a few hundred yards from the Churchill home, a reminder of modernity pressing against a village still largely shaped by older, harder ways of living. This was not a place where murder was expected, but violence of the kind discovered on that March morning and in a cottage belonging to one of the oldest men in the parish sent a shock through Knowle St Giles that would ripple far beyond its quiet lanes. Samuel Churchill was 83 years old in 1879, a smallholder of stubborn independence, still working bits of his own land despite age and infirmity. He had lived in Knowle St Giles for over 60 years and was known as a man set in his ways, with a little property, a cottage and an orchard, and not much to some, but enough to tempt others. Katherine, nearly 30 years his junior at around 50, had lived with him for some 25 years before they finally married. Her reputation in the parish was mixed, hard-working and industrious by some accounts, and quarrelsome and sharp-tempered by others. Their home life was no secret. Neighbours had overheard rows, insults, and even the occasional threat, and both husband and wife were known to complain of each other in the village. The son born to Katherine before their marriage, Sam, remained a frequent figure around the cottage, and not always to the old man's pleasure. The Churchills' relationship grew more only strained as Samuel aged. He spoke often of altering his will, dissatisfied with how his little all was arranged, and determined, according to his daughter, that neither Kitty nor her son should have a penny. On the morning of his death, he had dressed in his best clothes, intended to walk into charred to have that will changed, a detail that would later cast a long shadow over Katherine's every explanation. It was a troubled household, bound by habit rather than affection, and overshadowed in its final days by the quiet but unmistakable tension of money, inheritance, and a marriage long worn thin. From the Charred and Ilminster News, the 8th of March, 1879. Horrible tragedy near Charred. The mutilation of the body. The wife charged with murder. The neighbourhood of Knowle St Giles was startled on Tuesday morning by news that a terrible murder had been committed on an old inhabitant of the parish. Samuel Churchill was an old man. He had reached his 83rd year. He worked on his own land and possessed some little property, not much to some persons, but enough, it is feared, to excite the evil desires of those about him. The story of the poor man's life since the death of his wife a quarter of a century ago has been very sad, and the culmination fearful to contemplate. Soon after his wife's decease, he formed an acquaintance with the woman now in custody on suspicion as his murderess. She did not bear a very high character, which perhaps accounts for the fact that for a great many years they lived together without marrying. The clergyman of the parish remonstrated in vain, and at last, offering to perform the ceremony gratuitously, they were married about 9 years since. If his life was uncomfortable before, it was worse indeed after the marriage, and increased in discomfort as his age and infirmities advanced. Quarrels and struggles were of frequent occurrence, and it was evident that the death of Samuel Churchill would be most acceptable to those by whom his life should have been valued. The tragedy of Tuesday morning was, however, unexpected. Cries were heard, cries of murder even, but cries were so often heard that they had ceased to attract attention. On Tuesday, however, a woman did stop, climbed a gap, and looked in at the window. There she saw Samuel Churchill's wife putting something in the fire. She saw and heard no more and passed on her way. Soon afterwards the old man's wife left the cottage and went to purchase some articles at a shop near the Ship Inn, returning at about 10 o'clock, when she called to her neighbours for help and said her husband had fallen into the fire in a fit. There lay the poor old man quite dead, his hand cut and covered with blood on the walls and around about. The body on its back, the head and shoulders burnt, but a large wound at the back of the head seemed to tell a fearful tale of cruelty and crime. A billhook with blood upon it was found, which appeared to have been used for the murder. The man's hand was cut as if it had been raised to ward off the blows. The blood was on all the walls as if the victim had tried to escape. The woman's dress was also marked in the same way, which might be perhaps accounted for, but we have heard that another dress was found which was more deeply and largely stained with the crimson stream. There was great excitement. The police were sent for, doctors attended, and the many suspicious circumstances were considered to justify the arrest of the woman. If she be guilty of the cruel crime, what motive can be assigned for the deed? Samuel Churchill had made his will and had left his little all except a small legacy to a son born before marriage. But for some time he had intended to alter this will and otherwise dispose of his property, probably remembering his daughter, a very respectable woman in delicate health. On the morning of Tuesday last he had prepared to visit Charred for this purpose, and had put on the best clothes he had, little thinking he would never return to take them off. With the report circulated throughout the neighbourhood of Charred that a man had been cruelly murdered, the police officer at once proceeded to the house, where he found the body of the deceased in the centre of the room, on a board, and the woman Churchill throwing water over the clothes of her husband. From what he saw around and had heard in the village, he was led to think that there was something more, and added to this the very manner of the wife who, notwithstanding that her husband's body lay along the fire but a few minutes previously, was in the act of frying bacon, and although treating the affair in a cool and matter-of-fact sort of way, was sufficient to excite suspicion. The shock in Knowle St Giles was immediate. To find one of the parish's oldest and most familiar residents lying badly burned, with blood splattered about the small cottage he shared with his wife, was almost beyond comprehension. At first, few imagined anything other than a dreadful household accident, the kind that would befall an infirm man and an open hearth. But as neighbours gathered, details emerged that sat uneasily with that expectation, and so Katherine, known to all as Kitty, was quietly questioned. Her accounts of events would prove as troubling as the scene itself. Katherine Churchill's statement. The woman's statement was to the effect that at about 8 o'clock on Tuesday, she and her husband got up, and after partaking of breakfast, she left him sitting on the left-hand side of the fireplace, smoking, and upon returning from the Ship Inn, where she had been to purchase some bread and bacon, she found him lying across the fire. It seemed that soon after 8 o'clock, a woman named Watley was in the act of carrying some breakfast to her husband, who was ploughing in a field at the back of Churchill's house, and upon nearing which she was startled by cries of murder and "You brute!" This made her inquisitive, and she stopped and looked through the window, where she saw the woman pushing something toward the fireplace, and afterwards heard the door of the house locked. Upon reaching her husband, Watley asked her what she had seen and heard, and she related to him what had taken place. They did not, it seems, attract much importance to this affair, as it was not unknown in the village that the deceased and his wife did not live happily together, and they had been known to quarrel with each other on several occasions. Between 9 and 10 o'clock, the woman, the deceased wife, returned from the ship where she had been to purchase provisions, and she soon raised an alarm. "Oh dear, my husband has had a fit and fallen into the fire," upon which several neighbours proceeded to the spot. As the police arrived on the scene, what had been presented as an unfortunate household accident took an immediate and far more deadly turn. Blood spots were found dotted across the cottage floor, and beneath a chair lay a billhook, its blade darkened and bespattered in a way no simple fall into the fire could explain. Katherine's own dress carried considerable blood as well, far more than her story accounted for. With these first discoveries, the gathering neighbours stepped back, and the officers began the methodical work of collecting evidence. What had seemed a tragic mishap was now revealing itself as something much darker. Upon the entry of the superintendent of police into the house, Churchill was ordered to take off a large cotton apron which she had been wearing during the morning, which, after a little hesitation, she produced from underneath her gown. It was noticed that on the lower part of this apron, and also on the sleeves of the woman's undergarments, marks of blood were plainly visible. There were some places as though they had been recently rubbed or washed with water. The floor had spots of blood, and behind the door was found a billhook upon which are what appears to be blood stains. The woman was afterwards removed to the police station at Ilminster, where she is at present remains. Churchill and his wife were not living alone. In an upstairs room was the mother-in-law, but she is nearly 90 years of age and did not know of the unhappy event and is unable to throw any light upon the affair. An important feature in the case is that when Superintendent Geraghty was taking the prisoner from the village, she called out to her son, Sam, who was close by, "Mind the will, Sam. See you ain't cheated out of your money." Soon afterwards said, "I did not touch the old fool." Prisoner does not seem to feel the position in the least, but takes everything as a matter of course. The house has been visited by a number of persons. Superintendent Geraghty has taken the dress, trousers and billhook to Bristol for Mr. Stoddart to analyse. With the wife removed into custody, attention now turned to the deceased himself. The litany of injuries sustained by 83-year-old Samuel Churchill was shocking. Burns alone could not account for what the officers and medical men were beginning to observe. It was becoming unmistakably clear that something far more violent than an accidental fall into the fire had taken place. The body of the victim. It presented a shocking appearance, the upper part being literally charred so much that parties who knew him best could not recognise him. All the back part of the skull is burnt away and part of the left shoulder, with scarcely a strip of skin left on the upper bone. What appeared to be cuts at the back of the head and the fact that there is a nasty gash in one of the hands lead to the supposition that the man was cruelly struck with the billhook and was then thrust upon the fire in order to complete the deadly work. Local gossip was already circulating. Samuel Churchill had spoken openly about changing his will, and some in the parish whispered that those who stood to gain were well aware of it. By this stage the police were fully in possession of the house, and the investigation was underway. The remand of the prisoner. The supposed murderess was brought before Major Langworthy at the Ilminster police station on Thursday morning, charged with the wilful murder of Samuel Churchill, her husband. Superintendent Geraghty proved apprehending the prisoner on Tuesday and stated that the facts of the case whereupon the woman was remanded until Thursday next at 11 o'clock. The clothes of the deceased man were produced, and also the woman's dress and the billhook. A pair of boots also produced bore marks of blood in several places and was badly burnt around the top part. On the linsey were severally burnt bits and spots of blood. The hook, which was a large sharp instrument, was stamped with blood on both sides. These articles will be forwarded to Superintendent Geraghty to Bristol to be analysed by Mr. Stoddart. With the prisoner remanded and the key evidence now in official hands, attention shifted to the formal determination of how Samuel Churchill met his death. The violence of the injuries, the blood-stained clothing and the neighbours' unsettling testimony had laid a heavy shadow over the case, but none of it in law answered the central question. An inquest would be convened, bringing together coroner, jury and the grim spectacle of the body itself. Only through this process could the manner of Samuel's death be examined with the care Victorian justice demanded. The inquest. Mr. W. Monckton, coroner of West Somerset, held an inquiry at the Dairy House Farm. This inquiry was held to investigate the means by which the deceased met with his death, and they must not allow themselves to be prejudiced by anything they had heard out of doors, nor by the fact that a person had been apprehended on the charge of causing the death of Churchill. Charles Munden, a surgeon residing at Ilminster, testified that he had visited the Churchill Cottage with Superintendent Geraghty on Tuesday afternoon. He found Samuel's body lying on a door on the floor covered with a black cloth. Speaking to Katherine, known locally as Kitty, he remarked, "Well, Kitty, this is a sad affair. How did this come about?" She replied, I don't know. I haven't hurt him. I left him smoking his pipe in the corner whilst I went to the Ship Inn for some bread and bacon. And when I returned, he was lying on his left side on the fire." Dr. Munden then examined the body. He stated that the burns were extensive and concentrated across the back of the head, shoulders and upper torso. Parts of the skull and shoulder were exposed. The ear was nearly burnt away, and the muscles of the upper arms were blistered. These injuries, he noted, were severe and not easily reconciled with a simple fall into the fire. There was a fresh incised cut over the second joint of the index finger on the left hand, continuing slightly over the corresponding joint of the middle finger. The joint of the underfinger was exposed by the cut, and there was blood coming from it. The cut must have been done by a sharp instrument. Superintendent Geraghty drew my attention to the spots of blood on the floor, the table, by the fireplace, and by the side of the floor on a board screen. There was also a smear of blood. The marks on the table were on the top and high up towards the side towards the fire. There was also more blood on the table than elsewhere. Post-mortem. The following morning I made a post-mortem examination of the body. On opening the head, a very large portion of the bones at the back fell on the ground, almost in powder, being so charred. The brain at that spot was also much burnt, and after careful examination of the skull, I could find no sign of a blow having been struck. The bones were more severe on the right shoulder, extending down the back, more than that elsewhere. The body was so much burnt that I thought it was useless opening it. The burns were sufficient to account for death. Dr. Munden noted that during his first visit, Superintendent Geraghty found a blood-covered billhook under a chair. When he asked Katherine how the blood came to be on it, she replied that Samuel had been chopping sticks the day before and may have cut his finger. Spots of blood were also found on her dress. In questioning, Dr. Munden explained that the skull was so thoroughly charred that it was impossible to determine whether a blow had been struck. However, he stated that Samuel could not have been burned in the manner observed if he had simply fallen forward from the position Katherine described. The most severe burns were on the right side of the body, suggesting he had lain in that position for some time, inconsistent with her account of him toppling from a stool on the left. He added that a fall associated with fainting, apoplexy or epilepsy would not cause bleeding, although a fracture at the base of the skull would produce bleeding from the nose and the ears. As for the wounds to the fingers, he considered it entirely possible that they had been caused by the billhook recovered from the room. Witness evidence. Several local witnesses gave short statements that added to the picture of the household and the morning of the fire. A schoolgirl, Ellen Hart, told the jury that as she walked past the Churchill's cottage between 9 and past, she and other children smelt burning coming from the direction of the house, although they heard no noises. Two adult neighbours spoke more directly to the couple's long-standing discord. John Smith, a carpenter's apprentice, stated that he had heard Katherine say she wished the old devil were dead, and even claimed she had once removed a nail from a banister so that he would fall downstairs and break his neck. Jane Forsey, who had lived near the couple for 7 years, reported much the same. Katherine often complained of her husband calling him troublesome and referring to him as the old devil, and on more than one occasion she said she would be glad if he were dead. Taken together, the testimony suggested a marriage marked by bitterness and threats, and a wife whose reaction to her husband's death struck some neighbours as peculiarly calm. The following day brought a continuation of the inquest, with more witnesses called to speak to the Churchills' long-standing unhappiness and the strained relations within the household. Alongside these character accounts came further statements describing the events of the morning itself, each adding another small but significant piece to the picture of what happened in that little cottage at Knowle St Giles. The adjourned inquest on Samuel Churchill was held at the George Hotel on Tuesday by W. Monckton, Esquire, the coroner for West Somerset. Early in the morning, groups gathered to watch for the first appearance of the suspected woman. Katherine Churchill was brought from Ilminster police station in a closed conveyance and taken into the George, where a crowd waited, eager for a glimpse of the woman accused of so foul a deed. She was tall, masculine-looking woman wearing an old-fashioned cottage bonnet and a drab cloak. She looked about 50 and was anything but attractive in appearance. As she sat with a stolid, almost immovable expression, save for the occasional turn of the head as each new witness was called, she seemed carved from stone. No flicker of feeling crossed her face, and the painful details caused no visible reaction. There was nothing in her manner or appearance to excite pity or sympathy amongst the onlookers. The first witness was George England, husband of Samuel Churchill's only surviving daughter from his first marriage. He told the inquest that the deceased was over 80, a labourer who owned only his cottage, orchard and a small garden. Samuel had married Katherine about 8 or 9 years earlier, although the pair had lived together long before that and had a son, now in his early 20s, born before the marriage. Katherine, he said, went out washing for work. Samuel took occasional labouring jobs, and their household was small, poor, and long established, with family ties already strained long before the old man's death. Another neighbour gave a similar account, saying Katherine repeated her story of finding her husband in the fire, tended to her blind mother upstairs, and removed the old man's clothing before the police arrived. He also confirmed that Samuel had recently spoken of altering his will, a point that would later become central to the prosecution's case. Acting Police Sergeant Williams, stationed at Charred, stated that he reached the cottage shortly after noon on the 4th of March. Katherine Churchill was standing by the fire in her bonnet and cloak. George England was also present. The body of Samuel Churchill lay on a door on the floor, the back of the head and shoulders badly burned. He observed that the deceased was still wearing his light cord breeches, stockings and boots. Apart from slight scorching at the waistband, the breeches were not burnt, and at that stage, he said, I suspected no foul play. Williams asked Katherine how the accident had happened, and she repeated what she had already told the neighbours. When he stepped outside briefly and returned, she volunteered, I have not hurted the old man. While guarding the scene, he looked for Samuel's pipe, and on the left-hand side of the fireplace he found a short clay pipe, much discoloured from use, with what appeared to be fresh blood on the stem. He also noticed 2 fresh spots of blood on the floor near the table in the left-hand corner. When Katherine attempted to go upstairs, he followed on the superintendent's instructions and asked her to remove her cloak and apron. Both, he said, had small, distinct spots of blood. There were similar marks on her skirt, including inside the apron pocket. Katherine stated that the blood had come from her husband when she pulled him from the fire. Williams handed the items to Superintendent Geraghty on his arrival with Dr. Munden later that afternoon. Even while the police were still trying to piece together what had happened inside the cottage, another thread of suspicion began to form, this time not from the physical evidence, but from Katherine's own words. It came quietly, almost as an afterthought, as she was being taken away. When the superintendent was going away with the prisoner, she was about to get into the trap. A man named Charles Forsey and George England were standing together in the garden, and Mrs. Churchill wanted to whisper to Charles Forsey to tell him something. I said to her, "Speak out loud that I might hear myself." She then asked Forsey to come down towards the gate away from England, and he did so, and she said to him, "Tell Sam," meaning her son, "to go into Charred to see Mr. Farmer. Don't tell the Englands of it all." The superintendent then drove her away. Superintendent Geraghty stated that he reached the cottage late that afternoon. On entering, he saw the burned body of Samuel Churchill lying on a door by the fireplace, the prisoner standing nearby. After examining the room, he drew Dr. Munden's attention to several marks and said plainly, "There has been foul play here." He then commenced a systematic search. Under a chair near the door, he found the billhook, bearing several fresh stains of blood. Shortly afterwards, Sergeant Williams brought down the prisoner's skirt, showing recent blood spots. Geraghty also observed further stains on the small table beside the fireplace and on the wooden screen near the settle. He then cautioned the prisoner, telling her he intended to charge her with the murder of her husband. She replied, "I've never injured him." During the drive to Ilminster, the prisoner saw her son approaching and asked for the trap to stop. To him she said, "Don't cry, Samuel. Go and take care of the house," and then added, "See to the will, and mind they don't cheat you out of the money." As he walked away, she muttered almost to herself, "I never hurt the old rogue." On the following morning, further garments were delivered to Geraghty, the deceased's blood-marked breeches, and a woman's bodice heavily stained on both sleeves, with additional marks on the skirt. These were all taken into police custody. The next day, the 6th of March, Superintendent Geraghty carried the blood-stained clothing and the billhook to Mr. William Stoddard at Bristol, the county analyst. But here the investigation met the limits of Victorian science. In 1879, no test yet existed to distinguish human blood from that of a pig or a sheep. Interpretation rested on microscopy, chemistry, and experience. When Geraghty returned the following Saturday, Stoddard placed in his hands a written report. The findings now read before the inquest. Bristol, March the 8th, 1879. Mr. Superintendent Geraghty. Dear Sir, I have made an analysis of the stains and marks on the articles left by you on the 6th instant. The following is the results of my examination. 1. A pair of corduroy breeches, much burnt at the waistband, with spots of blood plainly visible, more especially on the right side. 2. The bodice of a striped brown dress with a spot of coagulated blood at the waist. 3. Skirt of striped light brown dress with a spot of blood which went freshly penetrated quite through to the lining. 4. The entire brown dress, much burnt in several places on the right side of the skirt, close to which were several spots of coagulated blood. 5. Chopper or billhook has 3 or 4 small spots of blood that has coagulated after deposition, with also one. If the blade had been wiped, the quantity of blood on the weapon is altogether very small. The blood on the different articles in the is the same and gives the same microscopic and chemical results. Although it is impossible to declare if it is the blood of a human being, yet the measurement of the corpuscles under the lens is exactly coincident with that supposition. On both arms of the dress, number 4, are extensive smears and small drops of blood, which are all quite fresh and very soluble in water. I remain, etc., William Stoddart, F.J.C.A., analytical chemist. Eliza Whatley was recalled. She stated that after the body was found, she and Mrs. Forsey went to the cottage, where she immediately asked Katherine about the cries of murder she had heard at 8:30. Katherine replied that she had gone upstairs to her mother and had only heard her husband grumbling. Whatley told the court this could not be true. She had seen Katherine inside the cottage at that exact time, viewed through the gap in the hedge behind the house. As she walked away, she distinctly heard a key turning in the front door. When pressed, Katherine answered, "I was not gone then. I went when the man was dead." Dr. Charles Munden was recalled. He told the court that the cuts on Samuel's left hand were not consistent with an accident while hedging. They were sharper, cleaner, and positioned as though the old man had raised his hand to protect the back of his head from a blow. The wounds were fresh, he said, fresh enough to explain the blood around the room, and not the sort that could have been made by the previous day without treatment. The coroner asked whether the blisters on Samuel's arms might have formed after death. Dr. Munden replied firmly that medical authorities agreed blisters cannot form post-mortem. When pressed by Mr. Bisgood as to whether this meant Samuel was alive when he went into the fire, the doctor added only that the hand wounds were, in his judgment, inflicted that same morning. Sarah England, the deceased's daughter, was then examined. She said her father had lived in Knowle St Giles for more than 60 years, had 2 children by his first wife, and had taken up with Katherine soon after that wife had died. They lived together 17 years before marrying and had 1 son, Sam. According to Sarah, the marriage had long been unhappy. Samuel often came to her complaining of Katherine's conduct. On one occasion, in August 1877, he arrived with his shirt torn, saying Katherine and her son had fallen upon him after he returned late from Ilminster Fair. He added that he meant to destroy his will so that neither Kitty nor her son should have a penny. At this point, the prisoner broke in. "This is not right. I went to bed and he came up and beat me." Sam then took him by the collar and shook him. Sarah resumed. She told the court that Katherine had once said of her husband, Sarah reporting Katherine's words, "He ought to have been dead years ago. There's no more harm in shooting him than a cat or a dog." Again the prisoner interjected. "I never knew what his will was. I knew there was a will, but not what was on it." Sarah then described visiting the cottage the day after her father's death, searching the bedroom. She found a brown dress marked with fresh blood rolled between 2 beds. Katherine reacted sharply. "That is another lie, Sally. That dress was left hanging on the banister." When her daughter held to her statement, Katherine flared again. "That is another of your stinking, nasty lies. Where is Williams? He turned out the beds." The coroner interposed. "You will have every opportunity of defending yourself." To which Katherine replied, "I can't be quiet and hear that nasty, stinking liar." Sarah concluded by saying that she gave the dress to Superintendent Geraghty and that the blood upon it appeared fresh. Several witnesses were recalled to identify the dark dress and the bodies found in the cottage. Mrs. Whatley and Mrs. Forsey both stated that they'd seen Katherine wear them many times and confirmed the garments were hers. Sarah England also recognised them, adding that she had not seen Katherine at the cottage when she herself first arrived after the death. As Sarah's earlier statement was read aloud, a reference to Katherine's son being born before marriage caused the prisoner to break in sharply. "It is his son just as much as you are. I can tell you that much." As the inquest moved through the tangled history of the Churchill household, attention turned from past quarrels to the question that now overshadowed every piece of evidence: the will. Katherine's own warning to her son as she was taken away to see to the will and make sure he was not cheated out of the money had already suggested what the prosecution believed lay at the centre of this case. And so the next testimony addressed directly what Samuel Churchill intended for his property and why these intentions may have placed him in danger. James Farmer said, "I am managing clerk to Messrs. Clark and Lukin of Charred, and have known the deceased for many years. In consequence of instructions I received from him, I drew up his will on the 7th of November 1877. He signed it that day at my house. The will, produced, leaves, with the exception of £5 and a Bible to his son-in-law George England, all his property to his son Samuel Churchill. His wife was to live in the house during her widowhood, and I prepared it exactly according to his instructions. I saw him about 2 months ago, when he said, 'I shall want to see you again soon and alter my will. I will come in again.' I never saw him afterwards." It may be fair to Mrs. Churchill to say that about 2 months after the will was made, I met her in the street and she asked me if I would tell her the contents of her husband's will. I told her I could not do so without his permission, and she had better ask him. This concluded the case, and the coroner proceeded to address the jury. The coroner reminded the jury that their task was simply to determine whether, how, and by what means Samuel Churchill met his death. He told the jury that if, on the evidence, they believed Katherine Churchill caused her husband's death by violence, they must return a verdict of wilful murder. But if they felt any reasonable doubt, the matter should be left for the Crown to decide at trial, where she would have the full benefit of any uncertainty. The jury then retired, and after an absence of little over a quarter of an hour, returned with their verdict. The coroner: "Gentlemen, are you all agreed?" The jury: "We are." The foreman: "Wilful murder against Katherine Churchill." The coroner then said, "Katherine Churchill stands charged with wilfully murdering Samuel Churchill. She will be committed to take her trial at the next assizes in this county." The prisoner remained perfectly unmoved during the delivery of the verdict, and from her features not the slightest indication of her thoughts were traceable. The prisoner, when being driven off in charge of the police, nodded pleasantly to her acquaintances. With the magistrates satisfied the case must be answered, the proceedings moved on to the assizes. By the time the trial opened, the death of Samuel Churchill had travelled far beyond the lanes of Knowle St Giles. The London papers had carried the story. Provincial journals debated motive, brutality, and the peculiarities of rural life. Curiosity swelled into spectacle. Seats in the courtroom were fiercely contested, and the public pressed in wherever they could for a glimpse of the woman accused of burning her husband alive. The prosecution entered the case with quiet confidence. They had the cries of murder, the neighbour's glimpse through the window, the locked door, the bloodstains, the billhook, and Katherine's own remarks about the will. For them the pattern was clear. Now it fell to the jury to decide whether those fragments of evidence formed the outline of a murder or the shadow of a tragic household accident. From the Charred and Ilminster News, the 10th of May, 1879, the Knowle murder. Sentence of death. The special spring assizes for Bristol and Somersetshire commenced on Wednesday last at the Shire Hall. This case came on for hearing on Monday and Tuesday, when the prisoner, Katherine Churchill, 50, was indicted for the wilful murder of her husband, Samuel Churchill, at Knowle St Giles on the 4th of March. The trial at the Taunton Assizes drew considerable public attention and interest. Crowds gathered early, seats were fought over, and the newspapers called it one of the most remarkable domestic tragedies in the county for many years. In truth, little new evidence emerged. The prosecution simply arranged the entire chain of circumstances: the neighbours' cries of murder, the locked doors, the blood on the pipe and the screen, the cut finger, the billhook, and the hidden brown dress, into a single narrative they said admitted no innocent explanation. The defence countered that every piece of evidence could be read another way. The visibility to the hedge was doubtful. The cries may have been quarrelling. The blood might have come from chopping wood. The old man's fainting fits were severe and well documented, and Victorian forensics could not prove whether the blood was even human. Both sides agreed on one thing: it was a wholly circumstantial case. After a long summing up from the judges, the jury retired, and after an hour sent back a peculiar question. Was it possible that husband and wife had struggled, and that an accidental blow had caused his death? The jury answered that no evidence showed a struggle, only the old man's cries. If she struck him without receiving a blow herself, it was murder. Minutes later, the jury delivered their verdict: guilty. The prisoner was instructed to stand. The clerk of arraigns called upon her in the usual manner, and the judge placed the black cap upon his head. He told Katherine Churchill that the jury had found her guilty of the wilful murder of her husband after careful consideration. The judge said he found nothing in the evidence to support such an interpretation and believed the jury's verdict was correct. He then pronounced the sentence. She was to be taken back to the prison from which she had been brought, and on the appointed day be taken to the place of execution, hanged by the neck until dead, and then buried within the precincts of the prison. He concluded, "And may the Lord have mercy upon your soul." The prisoner turned pale and seemed dazed by the judgment. The clerk of arraigns then asked whether she had anything to say, any legal reason why the sentence should not be carried out. She replied simply, "I'm not guilty." The court noted that this question was routinely put to women sentenced to death, as it concerned any condition that might require postponement of the sentence. Again the prisoner protested. "All I've got to say is, I'm innocent." She had not fully understood the nature of the question, so a female warder stepped forward to explain it to her. The prisoner then addressed the judge directly. "No, sir, I am not guilty of it, sir, not in the least. What they swore is false, and especially that they're Whatley's wife. I can kiss the Bible to it with a clear conscience. I am innocent of it, innocent as a babe unborn. There now." She was then removed from the dock. Katherine Churchill was executed at Taunton Jail on the 26th of May 1879, the sentence carried out by the public executioner William Marwood. As was now customary, the hanging took place inside the prison walls and attended only by the High Sheriff and a handful of officials. A black flag was raised above the gate to signal that the sentence had been performed. No confession was ever made. Katherine maintained her innocence to the last, repeating only that her life had been sworn away falsely and that she was as innocent as a babe unborn. Thus ended one of the most fiercely debated West Country murder cases of the 1870s. a conviction built entirely on circumstantial evidence, neighbour testimony, and the troubling domestic life of a couple long known to quarrel. Whether Katherine Churchill was truly guilty, or the victim of a chain of appearances that aligned fatally against her, has remained a point of discussion ever since. Further particulars. Before we close, a brief detour into what Victorian newspapers like to call the eccentricities of justice. In the case of Samuel Churchill, it reveals how uncertain the forensic science could be in the 1870s. The following example, published only weeks before his death, showed that the law itself could be every bit as unpredictable. On the very same day and in the very same courts, 3 defendants received sentences so wildly inconsistent that even the reporters struggled to keep a straight face. It is a small window into a system where theft could draw a harsher penalty than attempted murder, and where the whim of the judge mattered almost as much as the crime itself. Here is the account exactly as it appeared in the Times and then relayed in the Illustrated Police News of January 1879. From the Illustrated Police News, the 25th of January 1879, the eccentricities of justice. At the Middlesex Sessions, Ellen Taylor was sentenced by the assistant judge to 7 years penal servitude and 5 years police supervision for stealing 4 shillings from Arthur Penny, whilst John Fisher was sentenced by Mr. Sergeant Cox to 12 months imprisonment with hard labour for stealing 7 shillings from Richard Sherriman. Previous convictions were proved against both these malefactors, whereby an almost perfectly parity in the measure of moral turpitude involved in their respective offences was legally established. At the Central Criminal Court on the same day, Joseph Baker was sentenced by Mr. Justice Hawkins to 7 years penal servitude for chopping his wife's head with a hatchet to such purpose that the wounds inflicted upon her were described in the surgical evidence as dangerous. The glorious uncertainty of the law has seldom been more quaintly illustrated than by these 3 sentences delivered in one day by 3 eminent British judges. It is sufficiently surprising that of 2 criminals, both old offenders, arraigned before the first tribunal, it may be considered as identical with one another in every practical respect. For petty thefts, differing only in the amount pilfered, one should be condemned to endure 7 times as much punishment as the other, with the addition of 5 years police surveillance, in itself no light inflection. But infinitely more astonishing to the mirror unprofessional apprehension is the fact, forced upon our conviction by a comparison between the first and third of the sentences above quoted, that in the eye of British justice it is as heinous a crime to steal 4 shillings from the person of a stranger as for a man to hoe down the wife of his bosom with a chopper. Nowhere are the laws of the land more conscientiously administered than with the precincts of these islands. But we crave permission to doubt the existence of any criminal code and Christian demonstration save our own, in virtue of which petty larceny is visited with as heavy a punishment as attempted wife murder. And so, as the last echoes of the courtroom fade and Taunton's jail's black flag sinks back into memory, the case of Katherine Churchill closes, another fragment of Victorian darkness consigned to the archives. Outside, the moon hangs over the Somerset fields, much as it did in 1879, silvering the empty lanes where cries of murder were once heard. Indoors, a grandfather clock ticks on, indifferent as ever to human tragedy. If you found today's investigations interesting, Please consider subscribing, liking, or sharing it. It genuinely helps bring these forgotten cases back to light. And if you'd like to go even further, we're now launching a brand new Patreon exclusive series called Crimes Behind the Classics. We'll be exploring the real investigations and criminal scandals that shaped the stories of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Agatha Christie and Charles Dickens, and many more, alongside over 850 historical documentaries waiting for you, all for just £5 a month. This has been News of the Times, and I'm Robin Coles, occasional antiquarian umbrella repairer, licensed Victorian wallpaper critic, and part-time registrar of unusual teapots. See you next time. Same News of the Time, same News of the Time channel.